I'm the current director of the Center for Armenian Studies. And it's been a busy week. We celebrated 40 years of Armenian Studies in the university. And we still have a number of very exciting events coming up, including, of course, tonight. But I would also like to take this opportunity to invite you all to join us for our yearly Heidelstein lecture, which is coming up on April 7th. And this year, the event will be a little bit different as we are screening the Canadian Armenian actress and activist Arsenic Hanjan's theatrical adaptation of Auctions of Soul at Michigan State Theater, and after which Arsenic herself will be joining us for a question and answer session with film studies expert from the Bologna. And that will be an all in-person event only, and we're hoping that many of you will join us for that. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to thank, of course, our program specialist, Naira, who has been juggling many things today, including Giving Blue Day. Giving Blue Day is a university-wide fundraising effort, and the Center of Armenian Studies is using the opportunity to raise funds for our graduate students. As you all know, tuition and living expenses continue to rise, and we are committed to help our students maneuver these economic challenges by offering fellowships. And all donations to Armenian Studies of $10 or more will be matched 1-to-1 this year, thanks to the generous donation of Evangeline Ovanisian. And in addition, we might win $5,000 if we can account for the highest number of gifts, and it's the highest number of gifts. So the gift itself only needs to be $5, but they need to be plentiful for us to actually get to this $5,000 that the International Institute has put onto the table for us from an anonymous donor. Tonight we will travel in time to medieval Armenia with Professor Zaroui Pogossian, and Dr. Pogossian is visiting us from Europe, and it feels really nice to slowly have people visiting us again in person. And there's really a difference in the intellectual exchange when we gather in a room, that's for sure. Dr. Pogossian is an associate professor of Byzantine civilization at the University of Florence and the PI of the European Research Council project Armenia Entangled, Connectivity and Cultural Encounters in Medieval Eurasia, the 9th to the 14th centuries. She holds an MA and a PhD in medieval studies from the Central European University in Budapest. Dr. Pogossian has authored and co-authored many works in her field, and her monograph from 2011, The Letter of Love and Concord, represents, as Donald Kage writes, the first truly accurate edition, an English translation of one of the enigmatic yet fascinating vortex of medieval Armenian history. The work is the result of an immense amount of both philological and historiographical study and assessment, and as such, Kage writes, Professor Pogossian's book deserves to be heartily applauded by Crusade and Byzantine historians alike. The remnants and fragments of the Letter of Love and Concord, composed in the first decade of Europe's crusading movements, are scattered in libraries across the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. And I'm sure it was a great big feat to collect all of those, I think, 54 manuscripts upon which that volume then is based. I want to hear more about that. Currently, Dr. Pogossian is working on a critical edition and historical study of an anonymous Armenian apocalyptic text. And beyond that, she has written numerous articles and book chapters about Armenian history, culture, and religion, wherein she has explored such diverse topics as female asceticism and ascetic communities in early Christian Armenia, the role of women in the spread of Christianity in Armenia, monastic establishment and territory control, as well as monasteries in an interreligious perspective. And she has contributed, I think, significantly to the study of apocalyptic traditions in Armenia, and especially between the 11th and the 13th century. She has been the recipient of several really prestigious fellowships, such as the Alex Communal Foundation, the Kate Hamburger Collegium at the Center for Religious Studies, and the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities. She has organized international conferences and workshops in Europe, Germany, Hungary, Italy, France, places that she has lived also throughout her life. And she has served on editorial boards of the online journal Untitled Religion, and is one of the founding members and general editors of a new series titled Eastern Christian Cultures in Contact. If that is not all enough, she keeps herself busy serving on evaluation committees of the European Institute for Advanced Studies, the European Science Foundation, and the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And her talk tonight will explore the role of monasticism in shaping the medieval landscape and shaping medieval identities. And also, I think, take a look perhaps at the present day destruction of this cultural heritage and the creation of invisible landscape as a strategy of obliterating the memory of an Armenian presence. Dr. Pogossian will introduce us to monasticism from the 9th to the 11th century and analyze this religious cultural phenomena in light of historical political processes taking time in this context. And focusing on particularly on the expansion of certain noble families into territories. And there she will highlight the role of constructing monasteries, providing patronage, and the deposits of holy relics as only a sign and symbol of a princely presence, and also as a crucial identity marker. And these identity markers, some of them mobile and some of them meant to perpetuate the memory of their founders and of an Armenian existence in the landscape forever. Of course, this forever proved to be quite utopian then. And of course, the impermanence and vulnerability of these cultural markers was once again demonstrated in the recent war on Artsakh and cultural heritage. And I thank you so very much for being here with us in the room and for making the long trip to Ann Arbor. And yeah, I'm welcoming you to take over from here. Thank you all.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Melanie, for this wonderful introduction. I'm really embarrassed, and I hope the very high expectations that you have raised will be met with this talk. As Melanie mentioned, my talk today will focus. So shall I stay here, or if I move, can they see? My talk will look at monastic foundations, the spread of coenobitic monasticism in medieval Armenia as a sign of, firstly, territory control, as a means of controlling the territory and its resources by the so-called secular lords, princes, and as a way of claiming that territory by these very same elites. Traditionally, monasticism in Armenia has been studied as, let's say, a purely spiritual phenomenon, and clearly this is an important part of that history. Monasteries were centers of culture, learning, spirituality, theological, philosophical thinking, and there were also important schools based in the monasteries. So monks, scholars was clearly a part of the story, and it has been explored a lot more than what were other functions of these monasteries, other social functions of these monasteries. As far as the landscape is concerned, obviously they mark the landscape. They are say, human interaction, human change brought into the landscape. From this perspective, from the material perspective, monasteries have been studied for their artistic value, which again is very much part of the story. Some of these monasteries are masterpieces of architecture, of our medieval architecture, those who have survived or even those who haven't, because we have photographic documentation as well. So this is also a very important part of the story, but it is not the whole story. So my inspiration comes from these kinds of methodologies very much explored for the history of Western Europe and Byzantium also. This is a subject very well studied, very well known. So in a way, methodologically, we can turn to them. Obviously, that means reading more bibliography outside of our field. But methodologically, obviously, we cannot just transpose one methodology from one area to the other because social structures are different. But these have been my guiding, let's say, inspiration has been the so-called school of Toubert, the French school of Toubert, and that way of studying monasticism. So, okay, so the historical context. The spread or the flourishing, the moment of thriving of the Armenian monasticism is from the 9th to 10th centuries. They existed earlier. So when I say coenobitic monasticism, I mean communal monasticism. We know there are two forms, two types of ascetic practices, two types of organization of ascetic behavior, the so-called eremitic or anaporetic monasticism, people leaving their inhabited areas and living alone on their own in the desert, for example, in Egypt, in Byzantine Egypt, or in caves also in mountainous landscape. But this could be alone or just very small groups, informally living together, no formal rules, monastic rules and schedule, etc. When we talk about coenobitic monasticism, we're talking about organized communities. Obviously, there is a great variety of how this organization could be done, from Egypt to Syria to Western Europe to Armenia to Cappadocia. So this is another aspect. But the flourishing of this kind of communities who live together in larger numbers in structured location that we can call the coming of age of monasticism in the Armenian Middle Ages is the 9th to 10th centuries. This is a period that coincides with the weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate, who had conquered, Armenia was part of the Caliphate, and the breaking up of the Caliphate into smaller polities, various Muslim dynasties that emerged. This situation, there are also confrontations, constant confrontations with Byzantium. There's an entire no man's land where there are yearly skirmishes from one direction or the other.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can we move the microphone up to where that's over?
You can't hear me?
The remote person.
Okay. Is this better? Can you hear me? Is it better? I can also hold my mic.
We're waiting for someone to answer.
Let's see
Yeah.
what they say.
Okay. So I move on.
Sorry.
It's no problem.
Hi, Brett.
Yeah, we are used to it. So this situation of, yes?
Yes,
Okay.
that's good.
So the situation of constant tensions between the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire makes Armenia some kind of a neutral territory. So that shifts the trading routes, and this is research done by Manandyan already in 1920s and perfected by other scholars, shifts the trade routes northward. We'll see in the next slide some of those routes, which means bringing wealth to the land, obviously, and creating wealth which could be invested also in these monastic foundations. In 884, the Bagratid prince Ashot V received the crown from the caliphate. His title would be Sahib Lahman. Some years later only, the Byzantine Empire will recognize the change of this status. He's never called king, let's say. So there is one real ruler in the world in the Byzantine ideology, the emperor, Basileus, and everybody else is part of this family. They could be his sons, the best hypothesis. So the Armenian king or the Bagratids for him were Archonton Archonton, which means prince of princes. It's a translation of the Armenian Ishkhanats Ishkhan. So this was kind of recognizing that there was a change of status. He wasn't a simple Archon anymore. He was the prince of princes. But this situation creates tensions with other princely houses, especially those who survived the first onslaught of Arabic conquest. Some of the old latent princely families disappear. They are either impoverished or they die out, they expire, they lose their policies, are not the right ones, let's say. They don't manage to survive, like the Bagratids, Arzunids, and Sunnis. So these are the three main families who emerge from after the 8th century as the strongest, best organized princely houses in medieval Armenia, and the other smaller princes usually are submitted to them or allied to them, but they do not have a say, an important say in the overall politics. And we will see that these monastic foundations that I will discuss are very much linked to these families and to their rise, the consolidation of their power, and their control of specific territories. So in 908, the Artsuni prince Gagi, who was actually the grandson of Ashot, his mother was Sophie Bagratuni, he also he plays on, so the caliphate also plays on the rivalries of different Armenian princes. So if you want to be a king, great, yeah, you be the king, then the other one will be weakened. So he receives the crown in 908 as well, but he never calls himself the king of Armenians. He calls himself king of Vasquera. And similarly, 100 years later, the Sunni prince, Sambat II, receives the crown. It says the information comes from a 13th century source, which says the crown was sent to him by the Sultan of Khorasan, which is clearly an anachronism because in that time there was no Sultan, and we don't know whom they mean by Khorasan. So Minovsky, this great Orientalist, he thought that this could be some Rabbadi prince from Tabriz, and that for them was Khorasan, from the point of view of Sunni. This is the best explanation to come up with. But we see in all three cases, their change of status is due to the Muslim polities of the region, which were the superpowers of the region with which the Armenians had to deal with, had to negotiate their existence and their hold on their territories. I talked about trade routes. This is a pretty map I got from the internet. So what I meant by the northern route, I mean, I don't vouch for its exact accuracy. The next one is more accurate, but this was visually more pleasing, more easier to follow. But this is the northern route, and actually the foundation of Ani at the end of the 9th century coincides with this moment of thriving of the economy and the trade. And Ani, as we know, was a very important hub, a trading hub. Tvin and Ani were the two important trading hubs of medieval Armenia. This is a map from Sinclair's recent book. He actually focuses on trade in the 13th and 14th century, but he may also drew this map for the earlier period. So again, so-called northern trade route, and then he discusses how this changes yet again in the 14th century, but that's a different story. Okay, so these princes, the Bagratunis, Sunnis, and Arzunis, each of them had their basis of power, had their original, let's call them their ancestral lands from late antiquity, from since when we can trace their history. They did not necessarily coincide with the territories they came to rule in the 9th or 10th centuries. So what do if you're a medieval ruler and you're conquering a territory? You have to justify in all periods of times. Yeah, you need to use different means. First, to conquer, obviously, you need to have military to be able to get that and to control it also through the military. But just as important for the control of the territory is the shaping of the landscape, of changing the landscape and inscribing your name on the landscape. And how do you do that? You can found a city, as we saw Akshot founded Ani. You can build structures like defensive structures, towers, through which you control, usually on roofs. Obviously, these so-called fortresses were not for the people, for the peasants who were working on the field, and suddenly, like in movies, right? They hear the soldiers, the horses, and then they all run to the fortress. Obviously not. By the time they hear the sound of the horses, they're dead. And nobody's gonna let them into the fortress. That's for the Lord, or anyways, for his contingent. And from there, they see the army coming. So it's a function different from what we see in the movies. But just as important were the monasteries. Not military structures, but they created not only for the land, we will see through the donations of land to the monasteries and the use of these land resources by the monks, or they managed these territories. So the monks or the peasants who were also assigned sometimes to the monasteries. We have this information, especially for the region of Syunik, very wealthy history of Stefanos Orbelians informs us. So this was a way, because when you conquer that land, you need to make the best use of its resources. And the monastic foundations were an important part of this process, of the use of the resources and the control of the land. You also need some immaterial input we know how important it is, right? The ideas, the narratives, the newspapers, what you feed to the people, right? Not only bread, very important, but more. So we see these families, and I will just discuss a couple of examples which illustrate the pattern. I cannot talk about everything, but we are trying to get the patterns. So if you conquer a territory where the previous lords are gone, they have whatever expired, they've disappeared, which will be the case in some parts of Vasquera, we will see, you create narratives, stories that link you to the local sanctuaries, so already, a landscape already exists, right? The landscape is never empty, but you have to make it yours. You have to appropriate it. So you can build ex novo, a monastic structure, or you can become the sponsor of an existing structure. You can donate something and write it on an inscription on the walls of this church, which is a very visually, not everybody could read it, but probably people knew this is what King Sambat wrote on this monastery. So it's connected to it. You can also sponsor the relics existing in these territories by creating texts. And we have this in Vasquera, wonderful. There is an old icon, and I will talk about it, that was there, we don't know since when. When the Armenians conquered the monastery, we have a document which purports to be from the 5th century, but the internal analysis of the text shows it's 9th, which connects the Armenians to that specific holy object. So again, in this case, it's not shaping the landscape visually, but materially, but connecting the new lords to this landscape and its holy objects by texts, by narratives, by stories. Another very, very important aspect, which will be not just for this period, throughout the Middle Ages and also today, if you want, is the matrimonial alliances. So this was also a way of containing violence, of creating connections, and you could also overtake the other family's possessions, and we will see a case through these matrimonial alliances. But this was kind of like a soft power, using this type of expansion of your authority. Hagiography then fits with the narratives, as I was telling some, so if you have a relic, suddenly there is a new story about this relic, or the old stories become more elaborate and somehow start involving also the new lords. Maybe there are new miracles added which connect the relic to the new lords. So this is just the preliminaries, and then we can go on to look at specific examples. So I will start with a landscape that has not been obliterated. And so this is the site, the way we see it today, is the monastery of the Holy Apostles on the Lake Sevan. It used to be an island, in Lake Sevan, but because of the lowering of the level of the water, it's a peninsula now. Now let us just look at the history of how this was established, how this monastery, how all these examples that I gave play out in this specific case. The monastery was founded between 1871 and 1874. There are two dates, one of the inscription, another one comes from a colophon. The founder of the monastery was Mariam Sunni, so Princess Mariam, who was married to a Sunni prince. Her husband's name was Masakabu. He represented a junior branch of the Sunni family. It was a huge family with at least 5 branches. So there is a lot of work on this. Thank God I did not have to do that. So a nice genealogical tree with everything worked out, the dates, etc. So Vasak was, let's say, a second, not a very junior branch, but not the senior one. And his territory was around Lake Sevan. So Gerard Kunik, will see the map in a minute, was around Lake Sevan. Mariam was the daughter of Ashot. So she is a Bagratuni bride, very, very prestigious. And she marries a Sunni prince. Her sister, whose name was Sophia, marries Grigor Tereni Artsruni. So we already see these 3 families monopolize, kind of, right? Whatever is under, or Bagratunis try to, put their daughters everywhere, their agents everywhere, okay? So in order to found this monastery, Mariam collaborates with an ascetic man, Mashtot, who came from a very important monastery of Makenots. In a minute, I'll show you all these monasteries on the map. Makenots was south of Lake Sevan. It was one of the most important monasteries in Sunni, a very famous school of exegesis. The philosopher, the medieval philosopher, theologian, Stepanos Suneti probably was connected to this. He's the translator of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, wrote commentaries on the liturgy. So one of the very important theologians, intellectuals of 8th century Armenia. So just to give you an idea what this monastery of Makenots is. Also the liturgical tradition of celebrating saints' feasts, known as Tonapachar, also came from this monastery. So it was a monk from this monastery who created a list of what we celebrate when. So very important. This monastery was sacked by Babak the Huramite. We don't know how thorough the sackage was, because then some few years later there are monks there. So it was probably not razed to the ground. And actually this is a premise I have to make. Whenever you read in the sources that they raised it to the ground, in the Middle Ages this was usually not the case. If there is archaeology, you will see that actually no, a lot of things were in their place, and when they came back, they only had to do minor renovations. So possibly something like this happened in Makedon. But after the sackage, Mashtots had retired into the island of Sevan, where there was an old fortress. And he just abandoned fortress and he just went there. He was so famous that a group starts forming around him. People start coming to him. So they're living in this informal group. Mariam goes and talks to him, convinces him, we have to do this. I've seen a dream. So he says, no, I want to live on my own. I don't want to have all these other monks there. I like my solitude. Again, when they say monasteries are out of the way, isolated, nothing, don't believe that. So in the end, he has a vision of the apostles on the lake, and he says, okay, Mariam, you are right, let's do it. So they built the Church of the Holy Apostles on the island, and that becomes the main church and the nucleus of this monastic foundation. So this is officially, legally, this is a Sunni foundation, right? Mariam is the wife of Pastor Kabul. She is now part of the Sunni family, but she's also a Bagratuni princess. So in 882, her father goes to visit Mashtots on the island and gives him a relic of the true cross, which he had received from the Byzantine emperor. This is described in a colophon, a wonderful colophon. The colophons are beautiful because they are really like everyday news, every day, very specific to their time, right? And they are not history where obviously they have their own biases too, but very different perspective. So he leaves this true cross relic and also donations. Mariam also does donations of land, orchards in Yerevan, Arni, and also stalls in Ani. So we see how monastic economy is connected to the economy in the wider world. You know, Ani is a trading capital. They have stalls, so the profits from the sale of whatever they're doing comes to the monastery. But also what we see through these donations, this monastery, which is in the territory of Sunni, is now economically linked to the Bagratids, to the lands of Ivarat. So let's see the map. This is Sunni, and Kevakunik is around Lake Seva. As you see, it borders, I'm sorry, it's Armenian, so you have to believe me, those who don't read Armenian, that this green one is Sunni. And this is Ayrarat, the region of Ayrarat, the central nucleus, let's say, of Bagratid. It used to be the Arsasid royal domain, and then became Bagratid royal domain. So you're in the border area. When I'm saying that you use soft power to lessen the possibility of conflict on the borders, this is part of it. The monastic foundations are part of it. You don't have to go and conquer the land. So the monastery was here on the tip. You didn't have to go and conquer these lands around it. You could donate it to the monastery and make it neutral. It's neither Sunni nor Bagratuni. But if you have donated a lot, you are the patron. So you are the one whose name is linked to the landscape. You are the one who is shaping the landscape. So this is to show you the trade routes. I'm sorry, these are from old books and not very pretty, not very colorful, but they do the job. This is the monastery of Lake Sevan. And Lake Sevan connected to trade routes, you see? From Tavin, one goes north, and then along the banks, and on to Bardab, a very important trading emporium. In the 9th and 10th century, and this is the situation, yeah, with monasteries. So the circles are monasteries. This is the monastery of Sevan, about which we've been talking. So on the border, kind of the tip. Princess Mariam, throughout her life, found other monasteries, including with her brother, Shabu. And so Shohagavan, she found with her brother, Vanevan, also, where she gives donations of land, usually land, but also, as I said, economic structures. In some cases now, I don't remember exactly here, they would also give, for example, part of the donation would be the fish caught 5 days a week from this area. Only the monks have the right to do that. So this kind of economic activity could also be donated to them. And interesting is fact is also to think about Mashtots. Okay, so the first abbot of the monastery, he has good relationship with Ashot Bagratuni. As we saw, Ashot Bagratuni went there, gave him the relic. And what happens to him? Obviously, he doesn't want it, like he did not want the monastic foundation, but he becomes a Catholicos. He's elected as a Catholicos. He rules only for several months because he dies very soon. Nevertheless, he reaches the height of highest point of Armenian ecclesiastical hierarchy. And for the next few years, the people who become Catholicoi are connected either to Mashtots or the monastery of Sevan. So you have not only shaped the landscape there, you have really like changed the history on the highest echelons of the Armenian church. So Mashtots was the relative of the next Catholicos. This Hovanestras Fanaketsi is one of the most important Catholicoi of the Armenian Church and a historian. He has left us a wonderful history of the 10th century. So he was the blood relative. He himself says it in his history. He has a list of Catholicoi. They are linked to Sunnic also, as we remember that he came from Makenos, from the Sunnic context. So the bishops of Sunnic are related to Hovanes and so also to Mashtots because they were relatives. The next Catholicos is Stepanos of Sevan, clearly indicating that he came from the monastery. And we think that also Sarkis of Sevan was a relative of theirs. So several Catholicoi come from this royal foundation. We see how the connection between the royal power, the royal authority, and the Armenian Catholicos coming from a monastery, which was a royal foundation. These monastic foundations that, as I said, were all around Gerarkunik, we could look at them as encroachment on the landscape of Gerarkunik on the part of the Pagratunis, using soft power, control of the territory through the monasteries, until it comes a moment where you have gone really far enough where you can say, okay, enough, now it's mine. So indeed, this is what happens in King Ashot Pagratuni, imprisons the Lord Vasak Sunni from that branch of Sunni family and annexes the territory of Gerarkunik becomes part of Pagrati domains. So this is like a sad tale for them, for the Sunnis, and a happy tale for the Pagratunis, where we see how central the monasteries and the shaping of the landscape is for real politics. It's not just, okay, oh, how nice, now we all can pray together and copy wonderful manuscripts, which they did, thankfully, but more. The status of Gerarkunik also, to the map. I'll show you when we talk about Vasquera. It was close, also bordered on the Emirate of Dvin, so a Muslim emirate centered in Dvin, which was between the Ararat and Gerarkunik. So the Bagratids probably also intended, so you have easy access from Gerarkunik to Dvin. There is no mountains in between. So this also had that kind of strategic importance from a geographical perspective. Probably a similar pattern was followed for another district of Sunnic further south. So once you got Gerarkunik, you're going to look further south. I'm not going to tell this because then it will not allow enough time to go to Vasquera. I'm going to get to Vasquera. But we see a very similar process. So firstly, we hear information that Kagib controls some of the fortresses in Bayutzor. He's probably donating, making donations to an important monastery, Tsahatskar in Bayutzor. And it's again, these matrimonial alliances, he basically inherits Bayutzor through his wife Kata, who is also the founder of the Cathedral of Ani, in a process similar to what we saw with Mariam Pagratuni. So, but in this case, the marriage alliance was in the other direction, but it still worked in the favor of the Pagratunis in annexing yet one more territory of Sunnic. I showed that in 970 also Sunnic declared itself as an independent kingdom, but this kingdom of Sunnic did not include the region of Bayutzor, which was a traditional part of the territory of Sunnic until the 10th century. So, okay, what about Vasquera? How much time do I have? I haven't been at all.
15, 20.
Okay, oh, so iconic pictures, the Church of Akhtamar, the monastery of Narekava, where Grigor Narekvatsi lived and created his poem, no longer existent. And so this, the obliteration of the landscape, as I was, Melanie was mentioning, and the monastery of Baragaman. I will just discuss this similar, how this pattern worked out in Vasquera, somewhat differently. Okay, so Vasquera is here. This is a better, more accurate map. Here, actually, you see the emirate of Tebin, and below Nakhchivan, and the importance of Gerakuni. Why you conquer that and then why you absorb, because it allows you access to, and Tebin was an extremely important trading center as well. So you want to control that trade. As for Vasquera, so this is at its largest, greatest extension. The princes, the Artsuni princes, were not rulers of these lands before the 8th century. They expand from their territories further east towards west and south of Lake Van. In the course of the 8th century, this process is not easy to document. We don't have enough written sources. There is no archaeology. This is one of the problems. What happens when the landscape is obliterated? Archaeology is fundamental for correcting written sources, for providing completely independent information, often challenging very much the written sources because of the type of information it can give us. But the obliteration of the landscape means we do not have this corroborating or conflicting source information. So the area I would focus, I'm going to focus today is south of Lake Van. So Akhtamar, Van, and Ostan were the main settlements, probably since Urartian times, not probably Van for sure, was an Urartian foundation and never lost its importance as an urban settlement. Vasquera had specific traditions very much linked to the Syriac Christianity, and also translations of Syriac texts took place in Vasquera in the 8th, 9th centuries. Very important for the historical memory of Vasquera when the Artsunis got there are these two guys, Theodoros Rushtuni and Bar Patrick, and I've put this, just it's an anecdote, and actually if you go to the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, they say that, Gulbenk is actually Gulbenk, which comes from Bar Patrick.
Oh.
So goes back to the 7th century Prince Bar Patrick. I don't think there is that kind of connection. Not because Bar Patrick didn't exist, but between the 7th and the 20th century, a long time goes. And actually, the Rushtuni family expires. We don't know what happens after Bar Patrick. They are at the end of the 7th century. Theodoros Rushtuni was important because he was the guy who negotiated an alliance with Caliph Muawiyah in 654, which on wonderful conditions, but that earned him the curse of Stebeos, who says he did a pact with death, an alliance with hell. But actually it was a really advantageous agreement, very, very low taxes in exchange for protection. Let's say, for example, Byzantine Empire could not enter Armenia and conquer it. And although the 7th century is considered a dark period for Byzantium, it's actually another period of thriving of architecture on the Armenian highlands. So a very different perspective here. But their memory in the oral traditions of the local population must have been very important. It remains important until the 20th century. Even the ethnographers recounted stories about them. And there is the hypothesis that Theodor Rushtuni is probably the prototype of Keritoros in the Armenian epic tradition of Daredevils of Sassoon. So it's possible. So to show you where they came from, so this is a modern map, obviously. The homeland, the ancestral homeland of the Artsunis was what is today Mashkale, called Adamakert in Armenian, the original name. They were also a very important dynasty since late antiquity. We have testimonies about them in the sources of the 5th century. So they were not new, but they became more important in the 9th and 10th centuries because they expanded. And this expansion was possible because others disappeared, in the vacuum. So they go further, as I said, west and north. And there are 3 monasteries, very important, connected to their name, pre-existing, which they take over, reconstruct, and sponsor, for example, a reliquary, as we will see. Okay, let me go one by one. This is just the genealogical tree. The most important guy here for us is Gagik. Artuni, Gagik Khachik, he has two names, and also his father Grigor Deredik, because he's the one who liberates the monastery about which I'm going to talk about, which is the monastery of Arag, a little bit of chronology. When I say the memory of Art Patrick, I wanted to put this at the beginning so I don't forget. This is what was believed to be the grave of Art Patrick. It is called Horgom. In the 17th century, Arakel Dabrijetsi traveled in these areas and he recorded popular traditions. And there was all this tale that there was just a mound here, and one day a rider went up that mound and his horse fell, or he not completely, but sunk into the mound. And so he called people, they dug, and they discovered the grave of Art Patrick. Not only, there was another tradition that the Greeks came and they took the bones of Art Patrick and threw them in Lake Van. So the Armenians had made a huge deal out of this and beat the monks, etc., etc. But what the story tells us is that in the 17th century, this guy is remembered. It's part of the landscape of both his grave and stories about him. And he's a 17th century person. We're talking 1,000 years later. So let's imagine in the 9th century, right? So the Archonis come to a loaded landscape and they have to shape it in ways that are beneficent to them, but not offensive, let's say, to the population, that the population has to relate to what they are doing. And here we have Baragavank, another very important monastery, unfortunately gone. So this is a modern map. It's called Yedi Kilise, which means 7 churches, because it had 7 buildings. And this is a map, Google Maps. I must say Google Maps are very helpful in our times. And also when we think about it psychologically, for a long time we have studied all these territories without ever having been there or seen them. So if you talk to medievalists, Western medievalists, it's inconceivable that you study the monastery of Bobbio, but you have never gone to Bobbio to see where it stands or the landscape, what it looks into, east, west, etc. But this has been the case in the Armenian studies, to study these monasteries without ever having visited them. And even when the landscape is obliterated, like in this case, it's still informative. It still allows you to understand how high does it stand, what it looks at. Is there a road that it is controlling? Can it overlook the lake? What does that mean? And we will see what that means. So even an obliterated landscape, even when you try to raise the memory, it's there. The most important, oldest part of the monastery Barak, so there were 2 complexes, Upper Barak and Lower Barak. Upper Barak was already in ruins. Again, there's no archaeology, so it's hard to know when. These photos are before the genocide, obviously, and these are just walls left. The 19th century descriptions, beginning of the 20th, Hamazas Boskian, his volumes on Armenian monasteries, says that within the walls there were also slabs with Urartian cuneiform inscriptions. So it's possible that the holy site was constructed on an Urartian foundation. So what's so important about this monastery? On this location, on the upper part of the monastery of Barak, there was in the 7th century a vision of a cross, which appeared to a monk and his disciple. We have the story of that vision. And following that vision, the monk finds a piece of the true cross, he says. So it's a hagiographic tale with miracles. People come from all over to venerate the relic, and Bach Patrick builds a monastery to host the relic, to keep the relic in this new building, which was Upper Barak. Okay, so the older part of the church. So the tale of the relic is very interesting. It could be, I have interpreted as kind of an apology for Theodoros Rashkuni and his son Art Patrick for their alliance with the Arabs, because they were seen as allying with a non-Christian force. an enemy of the Byzantine Empire. Nevertheless, it was not welcomed by the clergy, right? So through the discovery of the relic and this patronage of the relic and the building of the monastery, they cleared their name. And the text that was composed at that time, it's a really interesting text from a theological, ecclesiological perspective and also historical. It ends, so it's a bit dedicated to the cross of Barak, how it was discovered, but it ends with an encomium on Bar Patrick and Theodore. Since all these great rulers, they were true Christians, protecting Armenia, fighting for the cause of Christianity, etc. But this becomes one of the most important relics of the true cross in Armenia. The monastery of Barak becomes a site of pilgrimage. So its significance goes beyond Vasquera. When the Artsunis conquer it, the first thing that they do, Gagik's father liberates the monastery of Barak from paying taxes. They would pay taxes to the Utmanid, the Utmanid tribes of Arabs who were settled south Lake Van, and they had control of Mount Barak and the monastery. So when he liberates the monastery, the first thing he does is liberate them from the taxes, make the monastery tax exempt. But Gagik too, when he becomes, probably slightly before he becomes king, the chronology is not 100% sure, he goes to visit the monks. He goes to visit specifically the True Cross, and he commissions a luxurious reliquary for the cross, for gold, studded with gems. There's a very nice description in Torma Artsuni. His wife donates this famous monastery manuscript, one of the oldest Armenian manuscripts. It was a 9th century manuscript. She adds a colophon, so she acquires it. She did not commission the writing of it, but she acquired it and she donated to the monastery in Barak. So it's important for its iconography because it's one of the earliest Armenian gospel manuscripts, but also for its age, obviously. It's currently in the Saint Lazaro congregation. I just put it because it looked very nice. The Horan of the manuscript and the door. This is the gate to one of the churches of the lower complex of Barak, which was the Church of St. George. A photograph from the end of the 19th century, this is from 1897 or something, demonstrates all the holy objects, the most holy objects of Barak. I don't know if you can recognize. This is the reliquary of the True Cross. I don't know if it would be the one that Gagik had commissioned, because it could have been also a later new reliquary. The throne was supposed to be the throne of King Sennacherib, so Gagik's son. The Mitra, because from 1113, Akhtamar, which was a seat of a bishop, declared itself to be a Catholical seat until also 1895. I had it on my slide, but I don't see that. Mm-hmm. So the Mitra of the Catholic was of Akhtamar. And what do you think this is? The gospel, probably the gospel of Queen Malke that we saw. So again, we're talking about 1,000 years after these donations, but they remain extremely important for the identity of Mount Barak. But what is even more interesting, I said some of this identity was mobile. When the Artsunis exchanged their territories for Sebastia in Byzantium in the 1020, so 11th century, we hear the continuator of Tokmar Artsuni says that King Sennacherib took with him the relic of the True Cross of Barak. It was probably not the whole relic, because the local tradition maintains, and also the colophon, that the cross remained there in Barak. Yet the other tradition says that it was taken to the west, and it also gets to Cilicia. We hear about the True Cross of Barak in Edessa, brought by Bishop of Barak, Pogos, in the 11th century. So this had become an important marker of Artsuni identity. So the Artsunis move, and they are moving their holy objects with them. The same with another holy object that we will see in the next case that I will very quickly go through. So on the one hand, so you have this stable monastic establishment, which should perpetuate the memory of these founders and the donors of those monastic foundations. On the other hand, you have also portable items, which you take with you as a piece of your identity when you're emigrating from that part. On the other hand, again, this is interesting how there is a bifurcation of tradition. The locals, people who remain in Vasquera, say, no, it's here. It's remained here. And there is a very interesting story of a healing of a Kurdish boy with the true cross of Barak, a very incredible story in a colophon, but I cannot go into it. Maybe for another lecture, another time when I come back. This is another reliquary. This is a reliquary from the island of Lim from the 16th century, now in the treasury of Echmiadzin. But I just put it because just to imagine when we say a luxurious reliquary from gold with gems, how it could be, what it could be like. And most likely it also had inscriptions like we see here and in many other reliquaries. So you make sure that you are remembered, you as the patron, as the commissioner of this kind. So it's not only a beautiful work of art, but it's also documentation, proof of your presence there and of your importance as a patron. I'm just going to go quickly through, and also because it's very sad to see what happened to the landscape after 1915. So as you see, the monastery was not in perfect shape already. Not all of its buildings were in perfect shape. The congregation had become smaller. Its heyday was the 11th century. The son of Gagik, who built this new complex, the lower barak, I said upper and lower. And this is what happened in 1915. The monastery was burned down. And now there is a village on the location of the monastic complex. But that means that some parts have survived, so if one day it would be possible to study these sites, and I think that would be one of the most significant signs that things may change, is to allow scholarship, because if we do not start with scholarship, collaboration between scholars, who can do it better? I don't know. So that would be one way of reviving the landscape, through the study of that landscape from unbiased scholarly perspective, as opposed to obliterating that landscape, making sure, which is also very difficult, as we saw, obliterating the landscape is not that easy. Just of course, this is the Church of Saint Sophia. Already, you see, it was not. This is one of the oldest buildings. Was one of the oldest buildings of the complex. Was not in great shape already, and now it's just part of the apsid. Other pieces that have survived, but still, it's not completely gone. I don't want to be 100% pessimist. Do I have time to go over another one, or? Yeah? Okay. So the Artrunis, like the Sunnis, were a huge family. There was a lot of infighting going on between brothers, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, also a lot of intermarriage within the family. Interesting. Not only with Bagratunis and Sunnis, but also between second or third cousins of different branches of the Artruni family. Another way, I guess, to contain the violence within the family. To understand some of these dynamics, and again, in connection with the landscape, we will look at another monastery, another famous monastery at Vasquera, known as Hogeatsbank, or the Monastery of Spirits, or Asfadzamor also, because its main church was dedicated to the Mother of God. Whereas the Monastery of Barak had the true cross, which is one of the most venerated relics. It's the highest, if there is a ranking of different kinds of relics, the true cross would be at the top, right? Then apostles, or because that is a relic connected to Jesus. You don't have relics of Christ, yeah? As you have relics of the saints. You could have other very prestigious ones like the Lance. In Constantinople, there was a church of Saint Theotokos of the Pharos, which had relics connected with Christ, like his thorn, his crown of thorns, etc. Other than that, the cross, the pieces of the true cross were the top rank relics. But also icons. So now Cristina Maranci has done a great job in completely revisiting the idea that the Armenian churches were not decorated, that there were no frescoes in the Armenian churches, that the Armenian church was iconoclast. So we are beyond that old paradigm. In this case, yet, but still it's true that we do not have many or very, very few small icons, objects like wooden icons like we see in the Byzantine tradition and also in southern Italy, the Byzantine southern Italy, etc. Yet we have a very important story connected with one icon, and a real icon the way that it is described from wood, which was believed to be made by Apostle Bartholomew, was brought to Armenia by Bartholomew according to the tradition of his church. Sorry, I lost the train of my thought. I forget the apostle who made it, because there was one of the story goes, the icon of Pogossian, that when the Theotokos died, one of the apostles was late and didn't manage to get there on time. So in order to console him, the others made the icon which Virgin Mary blessed herself by her hands. So this was a very special icon with a very close connection to Virgin Mary. I mean, these are all miraculous stories. I'm not talking about their truth value or anything, but as tradition, yeah, as the pious tradition. So this icon was in the monastery of Pogossian, which that monastery belonged to a family that disappeared, the family of Anzevatsi. The last member of the family was the widow of the prince, who married an Artsuni, whose name was Abu Belch. This Artsuni, Abu Belch, was extremely popular in the among the local population. There were several confrontations with Gagik's father, like really also military confrontations, didn't really work. So what did Gagik's father decide to do? His name is Grigor Derenik. I'm going to go talk to the monks. I'm going to go see what the monastery of Pogossian is doing. So he starts sponsoring that monastery. Let's see where it is located. So here, south of Lake Van, but it belonged, this area is called Anzevatsi, because it belonged to another family, which in theory, the cousin, that Artsuni cousin, had more right to be there, right? From the principle of legitimacy, because he married the widow of the last prince. But Grigor Derenik also wanted it. So this is yet another demonstration of how inscribing your name on the landscape by sponsoring of the monasteries works towards controlling that territory. So he made donations to the monastery and to the icon, and established an excellent relationship with the monks. And when his rival Grigor Apopelch fled to the monastery for protection or for hiding, they handed him over to Grigor Derenik. So this is also something that could happen, right? So they were on the roads and they could see the passage of the movement, also of peoples. Just again to see how the landscape has changed since 1915. It was yet another important pilgrimage area, especially for women, considering that it was linked to the Virgin Mary. On August 15th, normally would be the most important pilgrimage to the monastery. This is a photo taken by Nicole Thierry in the 1980s, 1989. So it wasn't completely ruined, also because it is more removed further from Van, like from an urban center than the monastery of Bara. So there was no deliberate burning or destruction, but just left to fall apart on its own. This is 2007, and they actually deteriorate very fast. Again, a wonderful way of overcoming this impasse would be a collaboration, because we should look at cultural heritage as a common human good, and collaboration for its preservation. Also, the United Nations Charter for Human Rights says, right, that the right to cultural heritage is a fundamental human right, regardless of race, nationality, or other categories with which humans may be categorized. Still some standing buildings, so still the hope is not completely lost for the possibility to study, although, like between 2007 and 11, it's actually rather devastating, rather fast, but that's the situation of Pogossian. But I think I can't go into another one. Just this would connect, this would show how it's true that the arts room is sponsored the pre-existing traditions, pre-existing monasteries, but they also connected these new territories to their ancestral lands and the traditions or cult of saints that were typical of their original homeland. So the Apostle Bartholomew, we already saw with Pogossian, this was in their native lands in Adamaket, or today it's called Pașcale. So the church of the monastery of Bartholomew, this is how it looks like. So it's actually not fared so badly, but how they connect the cult of Saint Bartholomew in their ancestor original homeland and Vasquera, but also the cult of the cross. So their ancestral burial ground was a monastery of the Holy Cross in Ahbak. And by sponsoring the True Cross of Barak, and then building the Church of the Holy Cross on Ahtamar, which I have argued is linked, its dedication to the Holy Cross is looking towards Ahtamar. It is making a link with this very important relic. But now that church obviously was Kagib Artsruni's masterpiece. So the most spectacular shaping of the landscape, this bedazzling church, but its dedication is very important for understanding this connection. So this was the church, the original burial ground of the Artsruni family. And what is interesting, that the Church of Ahtamar, the plan of the Church of Ahtamar follows that of, follows that of their original church in Ahbak. Okay? So also visually, the way you shape the landscape in your newly conquered land, or what you make your center of power, now Ahtamar, reminds of what you brought from home. So you move your identity also architecturally. Maybe I can put a picture of Ahtamar. Yeah. Yes, this is actually important. This is on top of the main entrance to Ahtamar, and it features this. And in my opinion, this is a visual representation of the description of the vision of the cross in that homily on the discovery of the cross of Barak. So various cultural, visual references to this kind of web of meanings that they put in place through the sponsorship. I mean, this is, of course, an architectural jewel, but it has a lot more to tell us that is not tangible, but we have to read it. We have to be able to read it, and it's not always easy. Thank you for your attention. I hope it wasn't too much. Thank you for staying awake and following me so carefully and so attentively.
Questions? And Zar, would you field those yourself? And I'll monitor the Zoom thing.
Okay. Yes, sure. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Zara. I mean, you really brought to life this sacred mapping of these monasteries, and the ending really with Ahtamar through the visual communication and iconography that then implants these different dynastic families within the landscape as well. So what I was wondering, and I don't know if you can even answer that, I mean, obviously, Vasquera is different than the monastery in Lake Savon, right? And they have different histories, even though you see patterns. So first of all, you said with Vasquera was built on a loaded landscape,
Yes.
right? And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that loadedness. So not only do these icons get translated and transplanted from different places to create eventually in time
Yeah.
through text, right?
Yes.
Through different kinds of relics, hagiographies. So how, is there any sense that you get from the early, maybe manuscript produced, I know you can't do archaeology, about this process of transforming the landscape or the holy space itself, the choice of the holy space itself in building sort of a new. So that's one question. And relatedly, is there a sense of, a process of who would go there? Is, the monastery itself wasn't self-contained. It was definitely, there's a lot of maintenance that's going on as far as trade. Is this a process of converting also not only the landscape, but converting the residents around this area? So
So the first question, the loaded landscape, I mean specifically when we are talking about the traces left by the Rushtunis. And we are lucky that we have a historian of our Truni family, which is Tomar Truni, who tells us things, We can find what you are telling me in this book, because he says that, the residence of Theodoros Rushtuni was on Ahtamar. So we know it wasn't empty. He says it there, but then when it comes to the time when Gagik is moving his residence to Ahtamar, says, oh, that island was uninhabited, there was nothing there, so he had to build from zero. So you start questioning, well, really, was it really uninhabited? On other occasions, he also says these, another village like Maharashtra is called, there was a Rushtuni residence, and Gagik put a fence around it and created a monastery there and appointed the abbot. So he literally describes how Gagik is making use of pre-existing structures. That's one aspect. Then we have another wonderful source from Vasquera, known as the anonymous storyteller. It was ascribed to Shapu Bagratuni when it was first discovered. So sometimes it is referred to as pseudo Shapu Bagratuni, but it is not. And I think the anonymous storyteller is neutral enough and not confusing enough, which is a collection of kind of folk tales, miraculous stories. And there we also clearly see how where there were once the Rushtunis, now come the Arthrunis and bring different meaning and take over the building, change it to something else. Like the case of, and that story also talks about the same, I said the residential building, which becomes a monastery, which is, I think, very interesting, how he changes the function. So he's making use of the landscape, but changing it. But when you have a monastery of Barak, you can't change the function, right? It's too important. I mean, the discovery of the relic is too important. So what you do, you expand it. Okay, the holy sites are on top, on upper Barak, but I'm going to do the lower Barak, a much bigger structure. Villages donated, so economically well-to-do, etc. So this is what I mean when I say the loaded, and that we can find other examples of this kind. Of course, archaeology would tell us, if we went to excavate, would tell us, okay, this structure is from the 7th century, really, and this one is from the 10th, or well, Thomas is not telling us the truth because there is something else in the 9th century. When I say the archaeology can corroborate or give us different kinds of information, this is what I mean. Your second question about who was going to the monastery.
Well, these villages, that's it.
Yeah, the
right?
villages. That is actually another question, very, very important, not studied really, because, I mean, that would be something to do. We could do that also in Armenia, to study the monastic complex to get wider in its context with the settlements. This is something we haven't done. This really would be like very new research to carry out in Armenia, to understand the relationship of the monastery with the settlement or settlements around it. Again, we have some written source. We have an excellent written source for Sunni, which is Stefanos Sunitsi, who describes monastic structures and says this and this and this village belong to the monastery. So we have an idea, and these villages we can map on the map. So, but still, we don't know the style of settlement. Did these people live in what kind of houses? How big was the settlement? How big was the population? These are all questions that we are not ready to answer.
Thank you.
I think Matthew had a question. And
I
then
have
maybe-
a ton of questions.
Oh, God.
So we'll keep you for a minute.
So, I mean, one of them was related to this, which was about the relationship between the sort of ordinary people in these monasteries, which you just said is a new frontier for future research. The other question I had was about the sort of financial management of these monasteries. So, you know, in the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, Armenian, as well as Islamic and Greek and other religious establishments had these foundations, these waqf. And I was wondering if there was an equivalent with these monasteries, so that even if their sponsors, you know, royal families expired or disappeared or whatever, that there was, you know, in theory, a kind of self-perpetuating pile of wealth that was supposed to keep the monastery going into perpetuity, or how that worked.
So these villages that are donated to them, in theory, are donated in perpetuity. So it's theirs. The stalls in Ani should be always theirs. I mean, the reason they were inscribed on the walls of the monasteries was to say it's set in stone, literally, that it should be, you know, really, if somebody came and said, no, this is not real, let's say, you see, it's written here. Okay, they also had charters, most likely. And the only charters we have now are the ones that Stefanos Orbelian copied in his history, which is it's one of the most wonderful histories of medieval Armenian historiography. We do not have original charters. Another interesting thing about Armenian monasteries is, like, for Greek monasteries, for example, there is a so-called typikon, which sets out the rules of how the monks should live, how the community functions, what they can do, what they cannot do, etc. If they can allow women or not, for example, things like that. We do not have this kind of documents in the Armenian tradition. No typicons have reached us. We don't know if they existed. Maybe they were just oral. I see, for example, in 13th century Sunni, there are some things, there is a moment when I think what is going on is very similar to Waqf. They have to negotiate tax-exempt status with the Seljuks. So the bishop goes to Isfahan, he disguises himself as a Persian, and it was not hard, the Texas was he spoke fluent Persian. So he goes to Isfahan and he gets a farman and a manshur from the Sultan, which I think from the perspective of Islamic law, the Sultan, it was a waqf. The source doesn't use that word, but that's probably what happened. Later on, in the 13th century, in some inscriptions, we do find the word Vachm, they write in Armenian, but it's the long word Vachm. So this institution does become something familiar, but later, after the Seljuks.
Okay, may I engage some of these questions that are posed on Zoom? So I'm going to talk really loud so that the microphone picks up my voice for people who are listening online. So one of our students, Kelly Hanavi, who I think you've also corresponded with, says, thank you so much for your talk. I have two questions. What are the stakes for you in emphasizing the political function of monasteries? And how are other Christian communities and their monasteries interacting with Armenian monasticism?
I don't understand the first question, but what does it mean? What are the stakes of emphasizing
The dynastic relationship, right?
for them?
Yeah.
Why is it important for you to talk about that
Why?
aspect?
It's a big why question. Why?
Okay. Well, I think the sources, all the sources tell me this is what
See, this
It's,
is
it's
such a great
important,
answer.
yeah,
Yes.
it's not raised, this question is not raised normally in scholarship, but it's all over the place in the
Yeah.
sources, so it's important to bring forth
Yeah.
and make this aspect. No, as I said, usually we think of monasteries as something isolated, nothing to do with politics, with economy. They are there only to copy manuscripts, produce wonderful illuminated manuscripts, write treatises, pray. So the stakes for me is to say there is more,
Yeah.
and politics is part of it.
Yeah.
And the sources are full of it.
Mm.
As for the other Christian monasteries, so we have a lot more from the Cilician period between Armenian monasteries and Syriac monasteries, and also Greek. So we have a lot of testimonies from that period. For Vaspurakan, a bit, it's not a lot, and we don't know if this meant interaction with monasteries or just with other Christian communities. We have translations of hagiographic texts from Syriac into Armenian in Vaspurakan, sponsored by the guy with Hokyats, who was connected to Hokyats Bank. The colophon says that. So there is an exchange. There is an exchange of texts and of stories, of translations. We know, well, again, it's not necessarily a monastery, but we know also Christian Arabic authors came to Armenia. We have from the 9th and 10th centuries translations from Christian Arabic, and we know some of them did come also to Ani. Maybe Pusta Luca came to Vaspurakan possibly, and who wrote some of his texts for Armenian patrons, but he's not a monk. But these inter-Christian relationships do exist and we cannot necessarily pin them down to monasteries, to monastic.
So soft power seems to be a theme in the questions. So, so I'll give you two of them at the same time. How's that? So I have to take classes. Okay, so Michael Pfeiffer says, thank you for a fascinating lecture. And he says, could you talk more about how monks are recruited and or move between monasteries, and whether that plays a role in the noble family's struggle to assert soft power over territory? That's one. To what extent do monasteries assert a kind of soft power of their own, perhaps in contrast to the power of the nobility, so localized soft power? Then Armin, a student of ours, Armin Apkarian, says also, thank you for such a fascinating and inspiring presentation. He says, I have a quick question, I don't know if it's quick, about the patronage of monasteries as, again, soft power. Have you seen anything in the research about differences in monastic culture or practice associated with the patronage of one noble family or another? What I have in mind is something analogous to the recitation of the khutbah in an Islamic context in the name of one ruler over another. That's a lot, sorry.
I try to answer Michael's first.
Yes.
No idea how the monks were recruited.
Okay.
Really no idea. The only thing I can say is the abbots normally are from these princely families also, usually from the same. We have a lot more testimony again from Sunni. I mean, I depend on my sources. I wish I could know more from other regions. And maybe the case of Sunni is typical, maybe it's not, it's hard to know. But they're really like the monastic foundations, the bishopric, it's all the same family. The prince is from Orbelian, the bishop is Orbelian. The monasteries are tax exempt under Mongol law. So they are doing themselves a favor, right? As opposed to, but this is a different context too. You know, they're giving it to them and they are not collecting taxes on this land. So it's just tax-free territory basically for them. And the abbot is their cousin, right? Or their uncle. So it's all within the same family. We do have in the 10th century also confrontations. Actually, one Armenian Catholic has to come all the way. He was Anania Mokatsi. From Ani, he has to travel all the way to Syunik to the monastery of Tater because the bishop, Tater, who was the abbot, adhered to the Chalcedonian church. And so he warned, he sent letters, says, you know, you are a bad guy, you are doing this, something wrong. nothing happened, and he came, he actually destroyed the monastery, it says the text, destroyed the monastery, excommunicated the bishop, but he had the help of he asked for help from the local ruler. So they could also have very hard power in these kinds of conflicts. How the monasteries asserted their soft power. You know, like the case, what I can think of is the case of the Hokatsban, when the rival prince goes to the monastery. You know, the monastery has power to hand him over. It's not violence, like they're not killing him, they're not going to war, but this is kind of puts its soft power in the service of one prince and not the other. So we could take it as an example of that. I forget the question of Armin. What was it about?
Is there something equivalent to the khutbah?
Yeah, the khutbah. You know, we could take some of these miraculous stories. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would take some of these miraculous stories as something along these lines. You know, we don't know if they have specific prayers on specific days for these princes, but we could imagine that on the day of the celebration of the Cross of Barak, you read that homily, and that makes a special mention of these two princes. So they are their princes, but in a way, yeah. But we don't have explicit information. We could imagine, also like imagine in the case of Sevan, yeah, you have that relic. Every time you do something with that relic, you exhibit it or people come to venerate it, it's connected to the king. And probably by extension to the Patronage dynasty, but I'm really speculating. I don't have specific enough information.
Okay, I have a couple of more.
No problem.
And these are going to the ground.
Okay.
I think. So Anush Suni writes that her question is related to her own research, and she has spent time in Van and has visited some of the sites that you're talking about. And she says, I noticed along with official inscriptions and figurative carvings on the churches themselves, such as Hachkas, in addition, there are often groups of simple crosses carved on rocks or stones, or natural rock formations nearby, such as the Van Castle. I wonder what those simple crosses represent and who might have made them. In the spirit of discovery of archaeological sites and wondering what they mean, Alan Whitehorn is asking, is ground penetrating radar being used to rediscover parts now seemingly invisible in these monastic landscapes? This is something that has been done, I think, in Latin America, right? And whether or not the Armenians or there is a project like that. So, but the simple crosses and perhaps radar.
So the simple crosses, I think most likely they can be compared to pilgrims graffiti. They are the pilgrims who leave a mark. That's very common, especially if these monastic sites were pilgrimage sites, and Barak was, Hokatsban was, the monastery of Mushi, Taron, for different feasts, depending on what they were dedicated to. So this would be the equivalent of monastic graffiti, and apparently these pilgrims were not all literate, possibly. So this was one way where they could leave a mark about their visit. Whereas in other, like in Jerusalem, it's full of Armenian pilgrim graffiti, names, etc. This is kind of like an equivalent. As far as archaeology, I'm not aware of that being done now in Armenia, but yeah, that would be a wonderful possibility. I mean, in Turkey, I don't know. I don't think it's still possible to excavate a site and say this is an Armenian site. We're going to study its different layers. This is one of the problems is you don't see the interactions, right? So if you go and excavate a city, if it's possible, right, like Khalat or nearby, we know there was a very extremely important Muslim presence there. So even to understand how was the landscape, who lived where and when. We can't do it. We are precluded. I don't want to say we're condemned to doing isolated histories, but this is one of the reasons, right? You don't see it on the ground. But as far, I mean, these things could also be done in Armenia, obviously. So in our, I mean, my project has an archaeological part of excavations in Drin. So we just have done the first season. In the future, we will do, well, if necessary, if we think it's useful. Yeah, I work with a team of archaeologists who are aware of all these techniques. And maybe one day, I mean, I cannot judge it because I'm not an archaeologist, but if they find it useful, certainly. But I'm not aware of other such.
This is my Zoom interaction.
It wasn't that bad.
Okay. Sure.
Do you, forgive me if I missed this, but do you know, is there any record of how many people were in the monastery?
Sometimes they say, sometimes the sources say, it's usually we don't trust them very much because they exaggerate a lot. Say, oh, there were 400 monks in this year in the monastery, or maybe they complain and say, oh, you know, this was a flourishing monastery, and now there are only 10 monks. Occasionally we have this kind of.
Because I wondered about the building of a monastery as marking the landscape, but importing a bunch of people into an area is also a way of changing the landscape mythologically.
Yeah.
And also a demonstration of power.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Very important point. And I mean, that, unfortunately, that aspect is not possible to study. Always in some cases we can, but it would be also interesting to see where they came from. Did they come from faraway places? I mean, there was this very important monastic school of Glazor at the end of the 13th century, in the first half of the 14th. In that case, they produced a lot of manuscripts, treatises, colophons. There, we do know that people came. It was very famous. So we do know that people came from Yersga, from Cilicia, from Mush, all over the place. They came and studied, and then they went back. It was kind of, it is called also a university, and some stayed. So in this specific case, we know there was a lot of movement. But whether this was the case in all cases or some monasteries were attracted more people from elsewhere than others, that's a question I cannot answer based on the information.
Well, thank you so very much.